Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay? Probably can't see me, it's a genetic problem. You can hear me fine though. Good, perfect. So what I want to do in a very short time is try to walk you through what has been about a decade worth of research that's been a partnership between myself and Forbes magazine. And it started in around 2008 when I had the realization that we really had outgrown the dialogue around innovation, that innovation as a term had become functionally useless. And that in 2008, the world fundamentally shifted in the wake of the recession. That we went from being in an era where innovation was the main dialogue, talking about technology and business models, to where something fundamentally shifted. And I would argue that where we are today is in a moment in history that is quite unique, where we are literally rewriting this planet from the ground up, a complete resetting of the operating system in which we live. Now, this, clicker's not working, folks. This is Uncle Izzy. Now, the reason I show you this is my family and my uncle owned a $6 billion a year revenue media company based out of Canada. They were the owners of Network 10 here in Australia, actually. And this was a business that was built with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and unfortunately fell to a very, very sad story, which was the company inevitably went under. 40 years of someone's life, $6 billion in revenue, mostly driven by the fact that they had not focused on the key changes that were going on in the world around how media was going to and was in the midst of being rewritten. So I take this shit really seriously. This is something that really affected us on a very personal level. Now, I went out as an entrepreneur. I'm a 5-time serial entrepreneur, and I went out and started another news agency, which in 2009 I ended up selling to the Anschutz Group based out of Los Angeles. So I went from being an entrepreneur predominantly most of my life to being the chief innovation officer of a 70,000 employee business where we were the largest live sport and innovation business in the world. Now, difficult because the owner of that business was 78 years old and has no cell phone and no computer. So talking about innovation and talking about how the world was being rewritten was a bit challenging. Now, you won't know the company necessarily, but you would certainly know the brands that we own. So the LA Kings, one of our brands, the LA Galaxy, the LA Lakers, and we were also one of the largest concert promoters in the world, seating roughly about 350 million people a year, with artists you would know, typically folks like Taylor Swift, The Beeb, you're welcome. And I say this because we were in a very physical business. It was very difficult. In the entertainment business, you put people in seats like this, you entertain them with other physical people, and you sell food and beer. That's basically what you do. So when I left the business, what I do now is I am a partner with one of the largest talent agencies in the world, and our job is to take the vast majority of talent in Hollywood and to help rewrite the industry by rewriting their careers. So I've taken this right from sort of failure right through the theory about how we're rewriting Hollywood today. And let me just take a quick step back for you for a minute. From a historical perspective, we are very, very bad at understanding where we've been. Go back to 1830. Just to understand the scope of this. Prior to 1830, when the railroad became ubiquitous for most people in the Western world, human beings barely moved. We barely moved. In fact, if you go back right to recorded history, to 4000 BC, in that 6,000 year period, between then and 1830, you had a better than 85 to 90% chance that you would live, marry, and die within 15 kilometers of where you were born. 85 to 90% of us, we didn't move. If you fast forward to 1920, when electricity became ubiquitous, we did most of this in the dark. So the reality is, if you think of where we started in 1920 at electricity to where we are today in 2016, talking about robotics and deep learning and machine learning and AI, you can see that we have moved more in a tiny, tiny period of time as a civilization than we ever did in the preceding 6,000 years. And what we've entered into is a state of time deflation. Time is literally shrinking on you. We know from both a quantum physics perspective, a theoretical physics perspective, that if you look at what happens in a minute today, an hour today, it is fundamentally shorter than what happened in an hour 50 years ago. You can look at that by the things that have cycles in your life. Take a look at the stock market. The last major stock market prior to 1987 was in the 1940s, a somewhat 40-year period. From 1987 to 2000, it was a 13-and-a-half-year period between major market crashes. Between 2000 and 2008, 8 years. We are clocking very close to another market crash based on the timing of where we see the seasonality. The cycles are literally shrinking. So when you think about discussions around innovation or doing stuff better, you really shouldn't be thinking about technology and implementation and execution. You need to be thinking about time deflation. Literally, time is shrinking on you. The sense of urgency that people talk about in meetings and discuss really is factually written in time. Now, the question is this working? Are we better off? Has innovation and progress worked for us as a society? And the answer is hell yeah. It really has worked. A couple examples. We have now in the Western world almost doubled human life expectancy. In the last 100 years, in fact, we've now close to over doubled it. But then you also have the old adage of, we work too hard. Everybody here thinks they work too hard. We're stuck in our devices, we work too hard, we spend too much time at the office, not enough time with our kids. Turns out you're dead wrong. That in fact, over the last century, we have half the number of hours the typical Westerner works. So we are living longer, working less, and if you look at civilian deaths by casualty of war, it's almost half since the end of World War II. So it is working. We are better off. Now, let me talk to you about the rewrite specifically, and I want to try to just draw a bit of a distinction between innovation, disruption, and rewriting, because they are very different. Innovation, I would argue, is outgrown as a concept. It is not functionally useful anymore. Innovation, to me, is today's incrementalism. It is doing stuff better, at a better clip, at a better rate, with faster marketing, better client implementation. It's all about better results. Disruption is very easy to define. It's the way Clay Christensen defined it. It's when you have an entrant into a market, low cost, high volume, and they eat their way up the food chain and take over market position. Rewriting, however, is very different. It often, and by the way, the thing you need to pay attention to, innovation and disruption are necessary but not sufficient for a rewrite. Rewrites are marked by two very specific things. The first is something that is a rewrite around you is having a deep impact on the way we live. It's a societal change. We are living in the largest era of mass institutional shift in the history of our species. Rewriters touch that. They affect the way institutions work and shift. And secondly, typically, when someone is a rewriter, it's marked by having an impact on an industry that was totally unintended. So if you looked at an industry, and let's say it was the autonomous vehicles, as an example, touch on so many other businesses and elements of our lives. It's a deep and effectual rewrite. Just think of one little issue, which is the mobility of the elderly. It completely changes that perspective. Picking up your kids at school, the healthcare business, urban planning, automobiles themselves. So rewriting becomes substantively different. And I worry, and I think too many boards and CEOs and executives are too focused on innovation as a concept or disruption and not focused enough on the systemic changes that are going on around them, which touch upon rewriting and resetting the operating system of the planet. Now, here's one of the reasons it's happening, which is inversion. Almost everything in your life that is an institution follows a power pyramid. Government, religion, education, your family. We functionally operated in this power pyramid where you had a prime minister, a CEO, a head of state, principal, pope. And what ended up happening was when the internet began to bottleneck and unchain human communication, we started to see this inversion of the power pyramid. Now, we are roughly about here, societally speaking, and we are living in this stage of seasickness, getting used to understanding what life looks like in a world where power pyramids are completely flipped. And that flip ineffectually covers so much other stuff in its wake that we end up being in this position where everything gets rewritten according to common sense on that flip of that pyramid. So you can see it happening in power structures all around you. You can see it in the last US election as a very, very key indicator. Now, there are many drivers of what's causing this rewrite, and I would argue post-2008, this perfect storm happened where many of these drivers came together at once and were in a position where you had this perfect storm of this confluence of events. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these, but let me give you a couple of examples. Technology is an easy one. But let me talk specifically about one element of technology. The thing that threw jet fuel on the fire is cost. Today, the tools of innovation are being fully dropped and democratized to a cost of net effect nothing. We're in a position where for almost the last 6,000 years, most of the tools of innovation, whether it was the Gutenberg moment or cable or broadcast or quantum computing or anything you touched, anything that was substantive technologically or touched base units of human communication, was really damn expensive. Now, these tools are dropping to zero and changing the way the world works in terms of how we democratize innovation. Let me give you just an example from my own life. In 1999, we built an e-commerce company that we took public. The engine that we built that on cost us in 1999 roughly 46 million American to build. My last investment in an e-commerce company, they had an engine that was about 25 times more sophisticated than the one we built in 99. Their fully burdened cost on that build was about 3,500 US. And by the way, it's not just about the big e-commerce mobile apps and that sort. It's about really heavy tech. CRISPR-Cas9 today, a DNA splicing and genomic editing tool, can put the hands of genomic editing into a high school student with about 2 weeks worth of education and about $20,000, where they're in a position to DNA edit out a species today, now. So we need to be aware of the change happening around the cost of this innovation because everyone that had a moat built around them is now outflanked. Let me talk about behavior, a second big driver. Human behavior hasn't changed much in 6,000 years until the rise of the consumer internet in the mid-90s. You are functionally unrecognizable to the people that walked on this planet 30 years ago. We are a completely different behavioral entity. Let me give you an example. If you go and went to the Pope in 2005, this is the St. Mark's Steps just outside of the Vatican. The white smoke came out of the plume. Pope Benedict is anointed. Let me show you the exact same moment 7 years later with Pope Francis. Now, in 2005, the point-and-click camera and camera phone was very ubiquitous. So why does this look so different? Exact same moment in time, exact same photograph. What happened during those 7 years? Social. The rise of social. What you are witnessing is a behavioral adaptation. We have evolved into a culture of people that behaviorally share the things and events in our lives that we care about in a very public way, in a way that would have been deemed rude or breaches of privacy only 10 years ago. It is a total behavioral shift. Let me explain why. If Darwin were alive today, he would argue that we have evolved and the data would back him up. If you look at data coming out of the sociology departments of Stanford and Oxford, you will see that we have caught up with science fiction. That in fact, you are now two people. Science fiction talked about this for decades, by the way. You are two people. You are a physical human being, the person that is sitting in a room, and best way to think about it is face-to-face interaction. And you are a virtual being, the person you are in non-face-to-face interaction. Phone calls, anything touching the web and mobile. Why should you care? You should care because your behaviors and your virtual ID are very markedly different than they are in your physical self. You do things virtually you would never, ever do in your physical self. And here's the other reason you should care. Because 75% of your time as a Westerner in your work life is spent in your virtual ID and not your physical one. The average North American spends 62% of their time interacting with close friends and family in their virtual ID and not their physical one. Getting this wrong is going to have deep impact on marketing, recruiting, managing your staff. This is like walking into a Japanese restaurant and speaking Russian. It has been the failure of marketers for almost 20 years. I would argue this is, by the way, probably one of the most important sociological findings in 3 centuries. You are functionally two people. Always remember the currency of the unit of the human being you're speaking to. And there are thousands of markers of these behavioral shifts. Again, we don't have time to go through all of them, but let me give you one example, which is trust. My dad is an 80-year-old dentist and a bit of a Luddite, and so when I would try to explain to him about this virtual ID, I would say, you know, Dad, turns out you would think that in your physical self you'd be more trusting. You can look someone in the eye, shake their hand, read their body language, see if they're sweating. Turns out we're wrong. Turns out that in your virtual self, you are typically 4 times more trusting than you are in your physical identity. And my dad could never understand this, and I finally figured out a way to explain to him. I said, Dad, you know, when I was a baby, would you take my baby pictures and post them in the lamppost in our neighborhood? He said, no, I wouldn't do that. It's crazy. It's illegal. It's not illegal. There are freaks in our neighborhood. He had a million reasons. I said, okay, I got it. So why then do you post hundreds of photographs of your granddaughter on Facebook and Flickr, which is a globally open, searchable, and very easily manipulated lamppost? And his face just went blank, although I saw him in his office deleting everything off of Facebook about 10 minutes later. But the answer is because he's more trusting. And we know he's more trusting in his virtual self. Talk about the last shift that I want to discuss, which is the capital market. Here's all you need to know about the rewrite that matters from a capital markets perspective. The blockade that investment banks put on public market capital access, big dollars that companies needed to compete, is now over. The embargo is lifted. In 2008, when they saw their brethren at Bear Stearns and Lehman go bankrupt, they lifted the walls. They would typically protect their Fortune 2000 clients, and they have now stopped it. In fact, lots of emails were leaked saying to their clients, we want to work with you, we can no longer protect you. And the best example of that, by the way, is Tesla. The electric car is not new technology. It is, in fact, older than the combustion engine. So how did Elon Musk, as smart as he may be, overcome a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign to keep this vehicle from ever seeing the light of day? And the answer is because Wall Street let him. You will see every industry, regardless of how mundane or physical, will have at least one market entrant with $1 billion in financing coming to take market share each and every year. So let me end off with the answer. And before I give you the answer, let me give you something to think about with respect to numbers. There are currently 3 billion of us sitting on the network today. Within the next 24 months, we are expecting the next billion to light up. That 24-month period and those billion people will be the single largest economic event in human history. Single largest economic event in human history. And all the smart money is totally focused on it right now. And if you want a sample of what that looks like, roll back the clock for 4 days, roughly, to Singles Day on Alibaba. Singles Day, their big one-day sale, I don't know why they call it that, but this year on Singles Day, Alibaba sold just north of $20 billion worth of product in one day. $20 billion. That, by the way, is roughly the same as Facebook's annual revenue. They did in one day. And the vast majority of this coming from the developing world. So keep aware that we are quite lonely on this network currently. There's only 3 out of the 7 of us living on it. And here's what we know about the playbook, and here's what we know works. Large organizations, small organizations, the data points the same. The answer is parallelism. The way you survive in a world that's being rewritten around you is you focus on building parallel entities whose job it is to put the master entity out of business. It's exactly how Google structured itself with Alphabet. It's exactly how Samsung structures itself. And here's the rule. Companies are very bad at understanding how to move quickly and react for good reason. They have real things to do and real employees and real quotas and real staff. By building parallel entities, you create an ecosystem that becomes unstoppable. And here's the rule. The rule that works is the companies that are most successful are the ones that create 10% new revenue year over year from new product. 10% new revenue year over year from new product. Google, by the way, is at about 25%. So while there is no specific playbook of how you function in a world that is being rewritten around you, I can tell you for sure this is going to be one hell of a 730 days. Thank you very much.